A king's fate once rested on a single, cryptic whisper from the gods. Ancient oracles were far more than fortune tellers. They were the ultimate political power brokers, masters of the human mind, and the closest thing the classical world had to a global information network. We are about to journey through 25 hidden stories that expose the shocking truths behind these legendary figures. You will discover the secret gases that induced divine trances, the deliberate deceptions that toppled empires, and the human dramas hidden behind the veil of prophecy. How did a simple village girl become the most powerful woman in Greece? What really happened when an emperor tried to force a silent god to speak again? By the end, you will see these oracles not as mythical legends, but as a profound reflection of our own timeless hunger to control the future. What is the one piece of the past you would risk everything to know? Beneath the polished marble floors of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the earth itself held a secret. A deep fissure in the rock released a faint, sweet-smelling vapor, a gas modern science identifies as ethylene. This was not mere geological curiosity. It was the very source of the oracle's power. On her sacred tripod stool, seated directly over this crack, the Pythia would prepare for her divine audience. She would chew leaves from the sacred laurel tree, not for flavor, but as part of a ritual to alter her mind. Then she would breathe deeply. The ethylene gas, a potent anesthetic, would slowly induce a trance-like state. Her body might twitch, her voice could become a guttural rasp, her words often slurred and disjointed. To the priests who stood by, this was the voice of the god Apollo speaking through his human vessel. They would listen intently to her ecstatic ramblings, translating those fragmented utterances into the poetic, famously ambiguous prophecies that would then be delivered to kings and commoners alike. The entire performance, the divine possession, had a tangible chemical trigger. The god's voice was in part a vapor. In the 1960s, a geologist named Gel de Boer began investigating this very idea, studying the rock faults under the ancient temple. His work, later supported by toxicologist Henry Spiller, pointed squarely to light hydrocarbon gases like ethylene as the culprit. This was the hidden mechanism behind the world's most influential oracle. Yet, even this compelling scientific narrative faces challenges. Later studies questioned whether the gas concentrations would have been consistently high enough to produce such dramatic effects. So, was the Pythia a willing participant in a chemically induced performance, or is the full story still buried? This intersection of faith and geology, of divinity and pharmacology, reveals a profound truth. The power of Delphi did not come from a flawless divine message, but from the potent, unpredictable fusion of a hidden earthly force and the deep human need to believe. But the sacred vapors were not the only force manipulating the voice of the god. The oracle's power was a tool, and tools can be stolen. In the 6th century before the Common Era, a powerful Athenian family known as the Alcmaeonids found themselves in exile, desperate to reclaim their city from a ruling tyrant. They turned to Delphi, but not as humble supplicants. They came as financiers. When the temple was damaged by fire, the Alcmaeonids provided a massive sum of money to rebuild it, constructing an even grander facade of polished limestone instead of the cheaper marble originally planned. This was not a simple donation. It was a strategic investment. With the temple priests now deeply indebted to them, the family made their request. They needed the Pythia's help to persuade the mighty Spartans to invade Athens and overthrow the tyrant. And so, whenever Spartan representatives came to seek guidance, the priestess delivered a relentless, singular message. She proclaimed it was the will of Apollo that Sparta should free Athens. She repeated this divine command over and over until the Spartans, pious and fearful of offending the god, finally relented and marched on the city. This was not a vague prediction. It was a targeted, politically motivated directive, a divine mandate engineered by human hands. The resulting war successfully toppled the tyranny. In the power vacuum that followed, a revolutionary new system of government began to take root in Athens, an experiment in people power that would become known as democracy. The very cradle of Western democracy was thus midwifed by a deliberately corrupted prophecy. This story shatters the image of the Pythia as a purely passive channel. She, or more accurately, the institution around her, was a conscious player in the high-stakes game of geopolitics, a weapon that could be aimed for the right price. It reveals a world where the divine will was a currency, and the line between prophecy and propaganda was dangerously thin. Even the wealthiest king could be undone by a single misunderstood phrase. King Croesus of Lydia, a man so rich his name became a byword for fortune, decided to test all the great oracles before trusting them with his most vital question. He sent messengers to 7 sacred sites with a precise instruction. On the 100th day after their departure from his palace, they were to ask the oracle what the king was doing at that very moment. Only the priestess at Delphi gave the correct answer, and it was chillingly specific. She described a scene that seemed impossible for her to know, a bizarre act of culinary desperation. She declared that Croesus was cooking a tortoise and a lamb together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid. The messengers, astonished, reported back. Croesus had, in fact, been trying to concoct the most unpalatable meal he could imagine, using the rarest metals for his cookware, just to make the test impossible to guess. Convinced of Delphi's infallibility, he then asked his real question. Should he wage war against the rising Persian Empire? The oracle gave a reply that has echoed through the centuries as a warning against hubris. She told him that if he crossed the river Halys, the boundary with Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, hearing only what he wanted to hear, took this as a clear prophecy of his victory. He raised his army, crossed the river, and met the Persians in a brutal, indecisive battle. As he retreated for the winter, the Persian king Cyrus pursued him, leading to the final siege and capture of Sardis, the Lydian capital. The great empire that was destroyed was not that of Persia, but his own. Croesus had made the fatal error of assuming the prophecy was about his enemy. He never considered that the empire to be ruined could be his own. This story reveals the oracle's most dangerous power. It was not the power to predict the future, but the power to reflect a person's own assumptions back at them. The message was never wrong, only the listener's interpretation. The gods spoke in riddles, and humanity supplied the meaning, often with catastrophic consequences. Far from the political theater of Delphi, the oldest oracle in Greece listened to a different kind of music. In the rugged highlands of Epirus, at a sanctuary known as Dodona, the voice of the god was not a priestess in a trance, but the sound of the wind. Here, a sacred oak tree stood at the heart of the ritual, its leaves believed to carry the whispers of Zeus himself. The method of divination was profoundly simple, yet utterly mesmerizing. Priests known as the Seloi, who were said to sleep on the ground and never wash their feet in a sign of deep connection to the earth, would sit beneath the ancient branches and listen. They interpreted the divine will from the rustle of the leaves, translating the patterns of sound into prophecies for those who sought guidance. But there was a hidden layer to this natural symphony. The sanctuary was surrounded by a circle of bronze vessels, great cauldrons and gongs placed carefully around the tree's base. When the wind blew, it would set these vessels in motion, causing them to gently sway and clang together. The resulting chimes and reverberations would mix with the rustling leaves, creating a layered, metallic chorus that amplified the natural sounds into an otherworldly concert. This was not an accident. It was acoustic engineering designed to heighten the mystical experience, transforming a gentle breeze into a powerful, palpable message from the heavens. While Delphi concerned itself with the fates of empires and the ambitions of kings, Dodona served a more intimate purpose. The questions posed here were often deeply personal. A farmer might ask which field to plant his crops in for the best yield. a merchant sought advice on a risky sea voyage. A young couple inquired about the health of their unborn child. This oracle dealt in the fabric of daily life, offering divine reassurance for the mundane yet vital uncertainties that defined human existence. Its mysterious decline remains one of history's quiet puzzles. The sanctuary was eventually destroyed by the same rising power that had defeated Croesus, the Achaemenid Persians, and later suffered further damage during the Roman expansion into Greece. The sacred oak was lost, and the bronze vessels fell silent, their music forgotten. The oracle that once answered the whispers of everyday people was itself reduced to a whisper in the archaeological record, a reminder that some of the most profound connections to the divine were not always forged in grand temples, but in the wind-swept rustle of an ancient tree. Alexander the Great faced a problem that conquest alone could not solve. He had taken Egypt without a fight, but to truly command the loyalty of its ancient people, he needed more than military might. He needed divine endorsement. This led him on a desperate 2-week journey across 300 miles of the Libyan desert, aiming for a shrine so remote it was barely more than a legend to most Greeks. The Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis was his destination, a place where the Egyptian god Ammon was worshipped as a counterpart to Zeus. The trip was a nightmare of scorching days, freezing nights, and near-fatal navigational errors, with his small band of guides almost succumbing to the endless dunes. His arrival at the lush, spring-fed oasis must have felt like a miracle, but the true miracle, or perhaps the masterstroke, was what happened next. As Alexander approached the inner sanctuary, the high priest emerged to greet him. In a moment that would echo through history, the priest allegedly made a mistake or a deliberate choice in his greeting. He did not address Alexander as a king, but as a god, calling him Paidion tou Deos, son of Zeus. The exact question Alexander posed inside the temple was a closely guarded secret, known only to him and the god. He never revealed it. Yet he emerged radiant, proclaiming that the oracle had confirmed everything he desired to hear, including his own divine sonship. So, was this a genuine prophetic recognition, or was it a meticulously staged piece of political theater? Alexander was a brilliant strategist who understood the power of symbols. A conveniently misinterpreted greeting from a priest, a private audience where anything could be claimed, and a triumphant announcement provided the perfect script. By being declared a god's son at one of the most revered shrines in Egypt, he instantly legitimized his rule in the eyes of the Egyptians, placing himself in the lineage of the pharaohs. For his Greek and Macedonian followers, it cemented his superhuman status, making resistance seem not just futile but sacrilegious. The oracle's voice became the ultimate seal of approval for an empire he was already building. This hidden story asks us to consider the ultimate political weapon, a prophecy designed not to predict a future but to create one. While Alexander crafted his own divinity, Rome placed its destiny in the hands of a mysterious old woman and a collection of books. The legend begins with the last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, and a prophetess known as the Sibyl. She arrived at his palace offering 9 books of prophecy, a complete divine guide to the future of his kingdom, for an exorbitant price. Tarquin, believing her to be a madwoman, laughed and refused. Without another word, the Sibyl walked to a nearby brazier, burned 3 of the precious books, and then calmly offered the remaining 6 for the exact same original price. The king, now both annoyed and intrigued, refused once more, so she burned 3 more. As the smoke from the second burning curled into the air, a cold dread must have settled over Tarquin. Only 3 books remained, and the old woman's price was still impossibly high. Yet the potential loss of the final 3, the last fragments of divine knowledge, was a risk he could no longer take. He paid the full, original sum for the 1/3 of the wisdom he had once possessed in full. This was not a simple sale. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, creating value through artificial scarcity and the terrifying finality of loss. What did Rome actually get for its money? These were not books of clear predictions about future emperors or battles. They were cryptic verses written in archaic Greek prescribing complex religious rituals. A strange plague, a military humiliation, a series of ominous lightning strikes. Only in these moments of existential crisis were the Sibylline books consulted. A special college of priests, the quindecimviri, guarded them in a stone chest beneath the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. Their power did not lie in predicting an unavoidable fate, but in providing a state-sanctioned recipe to avoid it. The prescribed remedy was almost always the same: the introduction of a new god or the performance of an elaborate foreign religious ceremony. This was the true hidden function of the books. They gave the Roman state a divine mandate for religious innovation, allowing it to co-opt the gods of its enemies and integrate the beliefs of conquered peoples. It was a brilliant mechanism of control, transforming potential cultural threats into pillars of the official state religion. The voice of the Sibyl, purchased under duress by a tyrant, became the ultimate tool for maintaining social order for centuries, proving that sometimes the most powerful prophecies are not about what will happen, but about what you must do to stop it from happening. While Rome managed fate with sacred books, another oracle offered a far more terrifying prospect: a direct conversation with the dead. On a desolate plain in northwestern Greece, the Necromanteon, the oracle of the dead, stood as a gateway to the underworld. This was not a place for questions of politics or personal fortune. It was for those desperate enough to seek answers from the shadows of the deceased. The journey to this knowledge was an ordeal in itself. Seekers would first undergo a period of isolation, sometimes lasting for many days, confined to the sanctuary's dark, cramped chambers. Their diets were strictly controlled: a regimen of broad beans, lupines, and a narcotic drink that likely contained a potent cocktail of hallucinogenic substances. This was not mere preparation. It was a systematic dismantling of their senses and sanity. The goal was to weaken their grip on the living world and make them receptive to the realm of spirits. The very architecture of the place was a weapon of psychological terror. Visitors were led through a labyrinth of pitch-black, narrow corridors, their path twisting and turning without any logical pattern. The disorientation was absolute. In the crushing silence, they would hear sudden, inexplicable sounds, the groaning of hidden machinery or the distant echoes of voices, all engineered to convince them they were crossing into the land of the dead. The final chamber was the most horrifying. Here, in the absolute darkness, the seeker would be led to a central platform, surrounded by a deep, water-filled moat. As the priests manipulated hidden devices, creating rumbling noises and spectral apparitions, the visitor, their mind already addled by drugs and fear, would finally see the shades of their loved ones rise from the gloom. The hidden story of the Necromanteon is that it was perhaps the world's most advanced haunted house, a multi-sensory theater of terror designed to manufacture a genuine supernatural encounter. The broad beans they consumed are now known to contain compounds that can cause vivid hallucinations and a condition called phavism, which induces a toxic, feverish state. The combination of sensory deprivation, physical disorientation, and psychoactive substances created a perfect storm in the human brain, conjuring visions so real they were indistinguishable from divine truth. This was not prophecy, it was a carefully choreographed descent into the underworld, proving that the most powerful oracles understood that to control the future, you sometimes had to first conquer the human mind's deepest fears. A city could be born from a single, cryptic command. As Greek city-states swelled with population and ambition, they looked across the sea, seeking new land and new wealth. But the decision of where to plant a new colony, a venture that could mean prosperity or catastrophic failure, was too immense for any mortal king alone. They placed the fate of thousands in the hands of the Pythia at Delphi. The question was simple, yet the answer was anything but. An envoy from the city of Megara once asked where they should build their new city. The priestess, shrouded in sacred vapor, gave them a riddle. She told them to settle opposite the land of the blind. The command seemed nonsensical. They sailed northeast, scanning the coastlines for any people who might be described as blind. Then they reached the strategic bottleneck of the Bosporus Strait, the narrow passage between the continents of Europe and Asia. On the eastern shore, they saw the thriving city of Chalcedon, its people seemingly blessed with a perfect location. But on the European side, the Megarians saw an even more spectacular peninsula, a natural harbor with commanding views of the sea lane. In that moment, the prophecy snapped into focus. The people of Chalcedon, they reasoned, must be the blind ones. How could they have settled on the inferior shore, overlooking this perfect, defensible haven right across the water? The land opposite the blind was here. They founded their city on that European peninsula, calling it Byzantium, a settlement that would one day be reborn as Constantinople and then Istanbul, a capital of empires for 2,000 years. This was the hidden genius of the colonial oracles. The prophecies were not detailed maps but conceptual keys. Another group, seeking a site in Libya, was told to found their city where they found a hide stretched from a cart. They discovered a man skinning a deer, its hide pegged out on his wagon, and knew they had arrived. The riddles forced the colonists to actively interpret their surroundings, to see the land not just for what it was, but for what it could be. This process transformed the entire Mediterranean into a Greek chessboard, with every new city a deliberate move sanctioned by the gods. The oracle did not just predict locations, it created a divine justification for expansion, weaving a thread of sacred purpose through the entire fabric of Greek colonization. The voice from Delphi did not merely guide ships, it built a civilization. While the Greeks listened to riddles on the wind, the Etruscans sought the future in a far more visceral place. They believed the gods wrote their will not on leaves or in smoke, but in the warm, glistening entrails of a sacrificed animal. This was the art of haruspicy, and its high priests, the haruspices, were masters of a sacred anatomy. The ritual was precise and brutally systematic. After a careful sacrifice, the priest would remove the liver, the body's central organ of blood and life. He would then examine it with the focus of a cartographer mapping an unknown world. The liver was mentally divided into a grid of specific regions, with each section corresponding to the domain of a different god. A dark spot in one quadrant might signify the displeasure of Tinia, the Etruscan sky god. An unusual lobe or a mysterious cyst in another area could be a warning from Uni, his wife. The hidden story here is not just the bizarre practice itself, but its profound influence on the very empire that would eventually conquer the Etruscans. Roman generals and consuls, for all their own state-sanctioned prophecies, held a deep, superstitious respect for this Etruscan science. It was common for a Roman commander, before a pivotal battle, to have both a Roman augur reading the flight of birds and an Etruscan haruspec standing by, ready to slit open a sheep and scrutinize its liver for divine approval. This was a form of cross-checking the will of the gods, a second opinion written in flesh and blood. The complexity of this knowledge required rigorous training, and a remarkable artifact has survived to prove it. In a field near the Italian town of Piacenza in 1877, a farmer's plow struck a strange, heavy object. It was a bronze model of a sheep's liver, about the size of a human hand, dating from the 2nd century before the Common Era. This liver of Piacenza is not a simple sculpture. Its surface is meticulously divided into 40 different sections, each one inscribed with the name of an Etruscan deity. This was a textbook, a training manual for aspiring haruspices to learn the divine map without wasting endless sacrificial animals. It represents a complete system of belief cast in metal, a frozen moment of a living, breathing ritual. That a Roman general's fate could hinge on an Etruscan priest's interpretation of a sheep's liver reveals a world where divine authority was a patchwork of different traditions, and where power sought confirmation in the most unexpected of places. The voice of the gods did not fade with a whisper, but with a deliberate, imposed silence. As the Roman Empire slowly transformed under the influence of a new faith, the ancient oracles found themselves on the wrong side of a divine war. Early Christian theologians like Eusebius and John Chrysostom did not see the Pythia as a vessel for a god, but as a mouthpiece for demons. They argued that with the arrival of Christ, these deceptive spirits had been stripped of their power, their voices finally stilled. The oracles fell silent not because the gods had abandoned humanity, but because the one true God had vanquished their pagan rivals. This was a powerful narrative of triumph, a story that turned the decline of the old ways into proof of the new religion's validity. Yet the earth itself may have played a final, decisive role in this theological drama. The same geological forces that once gifted Delphi its prophetic vapors may have also taken them away. Evidence suggests that a series of major earthquakes in the late Roman period could have shifted the deep faults beneath the temple, permanently sealing the fissures that emitted the mind-altering ethylene gas. If the Pythia could no longer breathe the sacred vapor, could she still speak for the god? The divine trance, the very engine of the oracle, may have been starved of its fuel. This creates a haunting convergence of faith and geology. Did the oracles decline because the demons were cast out, or because the earth closed its mouth? Perhaps the most profound hidden story is that both explanations can be true at once. The rising Christian worldview provided the reason for the silence, while a shifting planet provided the mechanism. It was the end of an era, not with a bang, but with a final, fading breath from the rocks below and a chorus of triumphant hymns from the world above. Not every whisper from the gods was divine. For every genuine Pythia breathing sacred vapors, there were countless charlatans operating in the shadows, running sophisticated scams on the hopeful and the desperate. The Greek writer Lucian of Samosata, a master satirist with a sharp eye for fraud, left us detailed accounts of these fake oracles. He described how a man named Alexander of Abonotichos built an entire cult around a talking snake god named Glycon. The statue of the serpent would miraculously offer prophecies, its lips moving to deliver the god's will. The secret was ingeniously simple. The body of the snake was constructed from linen and glue, but its head was a puppet, manipulated with hidden horsehair strings by an accomplice from an adjoining room. A speaking tube, carefully concealed, allowed a human voice to seem to emanate from the statue itself. It was a clever bit of theater designed to dazzle the faithful. The deception went even deeper. Alexander's operatives would mingle in port cities and marketplaces, discreetly eavesdropping on merchants and travelers. They gathered intelligence about business ventures, family troubles, and upcoming voyages, then sent this information back to the oracle. When a seeker arrived to ask a question, the god already seemed to know the details of their life, making the eventual prophecy feel terrifyingly accurate. And the prophecies themselves were masterpieces of ambiguity. A typical response might advise a merchant about a sea journey, saying, "After the storm, a safe harbor awaits the bold." If the merchant succeeded, it proved the oracle's power. If his ship sank, well, he had clearly not been bold enough. This system was virtually foolproof, playing on confirmation bias and the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. This hidden story reveals a profound and very human truth. Skepticism walked hand in hand with belief in the ancient world. People were not universally gullible. They were critically aware that they could be lied to, that the divine could be faked for profit. These exposed frauds show us an institution under constant scrutiny, having to prove its authenticity against a backdrop of clever imitators. The existence of these charlatans did not destroy faith in oracles. Instead, it forced the major sanctuaries to maintain an aura of genuine mystery and power. The voice of the gods had to be strange enough, powerful enough, and accurate enough to rise above the noise of the con artists. In a world hungry for truth, the greatest trick was making the real thing seem more real than the fake. Long before the haruspices of Etruria, the priests of Mesopotamia were already masters of reading fate in flesh and blood. In the shadow of Babylon's great ziggurats, a far more ancient and systematic form of divination was practiced, one that saw the liver not as a map of gods, but as a clay tablet inscribed by the divine. This was the science of extispicy, a ritual so precise it blurred the line between magic and the first stirrings of empirical observation. A sheep would be carefully selected, its purity beyond question, and a specific prayer would be recited as it was sacrificed. The priest, known as a baru, would then remove the liver with practiced hands, his focus absolute. He was not looking for the domains of gods, but for specific physical anomalies. A notch on the gate of the palace lobe might foretell a breach in the city walls. A strange discoloration on the path of the king could signal a future illness for the ruler. But the most ominous signs were those left by invisible invaders. The Babylonians believed in malevolent spirits called the seers, destructive forces that brought illness, strife, and bad fortune. These demons did not just haunt the air, they could physically invade a person or even an entire kingdom, and their presence could be diagnosed. The baru would scan the glistening surface of the organ, searching for the telltale marks of a cursed touch. A peculiar cyst, a sudden bulge, or a pattern of spots was not a random flaw. It was a spiritual infection made visible, a divine warning that malevolent forces were at work and needed to be ritually expelled. This was divination as a form of celestial medicine, diagnosing the health of the state by examining its spiritual organs. The hidden story here is the breathtaking scale of documentation that followed. Every significant omen, its interpretation, and the historical outcome that followed was meticulously recorded on clay tablets, creating a vast, searchable database of prophecy and result. If a finger-shaped mark on the liver was followed by a successful harvest, that correlation was etched into the permanent record. Over centuries, this produced a legacy of thousands of tablets, a cumulative science of fate built one observation at a time. This was not random guesswork. It was a rigorous, written tradition that sought patterns in chaos, attempting to impose a predictable order on an unpredictable world. In this, the Babylonian seers were building a bridge. They stood with one foot in the world of spirits and incantations, and the other in a world of careful record-keeping and systematic analysis. They were, in their own way, the first data scientists, using the liver as their raw data to try and forecast the future. The voice of the gods was no longer just a whisper on the wind. It was a complex text written in the language of anatomy, waiting for a trained priest to translate its dire warnings. Even the divine voice could crack under the strain. The Pythia was not an unfeeling machine, but a woman often selected from the peasantry of Delphi, thrust into a role of unimaginable pressure. Imagine the weight, the terror of knowing that kings and generals were waiting on your every slurred word, that the fate of cities rested on the priest's interpretation of your trance-induced ramblings. This psychological burden was immense, and there were days when the entire system faltered. The most famous failure struck the city of Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. Desperate for guidance, the Spartans were told by the Pythia that victory would be theirs if they went to war with all their might. They did, and the result was one of the most humiliating military surrenders in Greek history, the surrender at Sphacteria. An entire Spartan garrison, the supposedly invincible warriors, was forced to lay down their arms. The prophecy had been catastrophically wrong. So how did the institution of Delphi survive such a public debacle? The priests had a ready-made defense, a brilliant theological safety net. The failure was never with the god, they would explain, but always with the mortal listener. Apollo's words were perfect and infallible, but human understanding was flawed. Perhaps the Spartans had not performed the correct sacrifices before seeking advice. Maybe they had offended the god in some unknowable way, rendering the prophecy void. Or, most commonly, they had simply misinterpreted the divine poetry. The oracle's response was a sacred riddle, and if you solved it incorrectly, the disastrous outcome was your own fault. This mechanism of blame shifting was a masterstroke of institutional self-preservation. It transformed objective failure into a matter of subjective error, protecting the oracle's core authority for centuries. A political or military disaster could thus be spun not as a crack in the divine facade, but as a lesson in human fallibility. The hidden story here is not just that prophecies failed, but that the system was designed to absorb those failures, learning from each misstep to tighten its control over the narrative. Every collapsed empire or lost battle attributed to human error only reinforced the idea that the god's wisdom was so profound it could be easily misread. The voice from Delphi could never be wrong, only dangerously misunderstood. Some oracles demanded not just faith, but a piece of your sanity. In the quiet town of Lebedea, the oracle of Trophonius offered divine knowledge through a ritual of pure psychological horror. This was not a journey to hear a prophecy, it was a descent into the underworld itself. For days, a seeker would undergo elaborate purification rites, living in a special building dedicated to the spirit of the hero Trophonius, offering sacrifices to appease the chthonic powers that ruled this place. The final preparation was a chillingly symbolic act. The person was led to 2 nearby springs and made to drink from each in turn. The first was the water of Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, intended to wipe their mind clean of all earthly concerns. The second was the water of Mnemosyne, the spring of memory, preparing them to remember every terrifying detail of the vision they were about to receive. This was the setup for a complete mental reprogramming, a forced amnesia followed by a hyper-aware state of recall. Then came the moment of truth. The seeker would approach a narrow, man-sized hole in the ground, clutching a honey cake as an offering to the spirits below. They would kneel, and then, in a grotesque inversion of a natural birth, they were grabbed by their feet and pulled violently into the dark, subterranean chamber. Inside, they were not given a clear message by a priestess. Instead, in the absolute blackness, they would experience a series of overwhelming visions, a chaotic flood of sights and sounds directly imposed upon their consciousness by the god. The information they sought was there, but it was encoded in a nightmare. When they finally emerged, hauled back out through the same narrow opening, they were often in a state of catatonic shock, their eyes wide with a terror that never fully faded. The locals had a saying that a person who had visited Trophonius had forgotten how to laugh. This was the oracle's most profound hidden story, the terrifying cost of forbidden knowledge. It presented divine truth not as a comforting guide, but as a traumatic, life-shattering event that stripped away your innocence and your joy. While other oracles spoke in riddles you had to solve, Trophonius offered an answer you had to survive. The Pythia was the most powerful woman in the classical world, yet she could not own property in her own name. This is the central paradox of the female oracle, a figure who commanded the respect of emperors while living under the strictest control. In a society where women were largely confined to the private sphere, the priestess at Delphi operated at the very heart of public and political life. Her voice could launch fleets and topple dynasties, but the woman herself was a carefully managed instrument. The candidates for this sacred role were not chosen from the aristocratic elite. They were typically selected from the local peasant families of Delphi, women of humble means and little formal education. This was a deliberate strategy. A woman from a powerful family might have her own political allegiances, her own agenda. A poor, uneducated woman was a cleaner vessel, more pliable, and less likely to interfere with the priestly interpretations of her divine ravings. Once chosen, her life was not one of royal privilege, but of sacred seclusion. She lived apart from her own family in a dedicated residence, her every movement monitored by the temple priests. She was required to remain chaste for the duration of her service, her body considered a temple for the god Apollo alone. This enforced purity was as much about control as it was about sanctity. severing her from the normal bonds of family and society that might influence her. So we are left with a profound contradiction. The words that emerged from her lips held the power to shape history, but the woman speaking them lived a life of intense isolation and regulation. She was the ultimate insider and the ultimate outsider simultaneously. She was revered as the voice of a god, yet treated as a fragile, dangerous object that required constant supervision. This hidden story forces us to look past the divine trance and see the human reality, a reminder that the most influential voices are sometimes the most confined. The voices of kings and generals have faded, but the whispers of the common people remain. At the sanctuary of Dodona, archaeologists unearthed a collection of humble lead and bronze tablets, thin sheets of metal pressed with the urgent, personal questions of everyday Greeks. These were not inquiries about war or empire. They are the raw, unfiltered anxieties of the human heart, etched into metal for the god Zeus himself. One man scratches out his dilemma. Should I take a wife? A woman, her hope and fear inseparable, asks the simple, profound question. Will I have children? A merchant plagued by suspicion demands to know. Is the thief my slave? These tablets were the ancient world's prayer hotline, a direct line to the divine for problems too small for history books, yet too large for any one person to bear alone. The hidden story here is the stunning intimacy of it all. A farmer wonders if buying a specific plot of land will be profitable. A traveler seeks assurance for a sea voyage. A slave inquires if he will finally be freed. Each piece of folded lead represents a single human life suspended in a moment of uncertainty, turning to the rustle of the sacred oak for a sliver of clarity. This is the other side of the oracle's power, a world away from the geopolitical chess games of Delphi. It reveals that the divine was not reserved for the elite. For the price of a small piece of lead and the effort to inscribe it, a shepherd, a potter, or a housewife could participate in the same system that guided the fates of cities. The oracle was a psychological anchor in a turbulent and unpredictable world, offering a way to outsource life's most paralyzing decisions. These tiny, crinkled tablets prove that the hunger for answers, for a sign that things might turn out right, is the most democratic and timeless force of all. A prophetess stood in the sun-baked silence of the Libyan desert, her voice all but erased by the sands of time. While the Sibyl of Cumae bargained with Roman kings, her lesser-known counterpart, the Libyan Sibyl, wove her own tapestry of visions. The hidden story of her lost prophecies reveals a startling act of cultural theft, where the words of a pagan seer were kidnapped and remade for a new world. Early Christian writers living in a volatile Roman Empire faced a profound challenge. To convince a skeptical audience, they needed more than just their own scriptures. They sought proof within the enemy's own camp, and so they turned to the Sibyls. They scoured existing Greek and Roman texts, collecting and often creatively editing the oracular verses attributed to the Libyan Sibyl. In these, they claimed to find stunning premonitions, a specific acrostic poem where the first letters of each line spelled out the Greek words for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, was hailed as her work. They argued this pagan prophetess, centuries before the birth of Jesus, had foretold his coming, his ministry, and his role as judge. This was not a discovery. It was a deliberate, brilliant repurposing. The voice of a woman who once spoke for the old gods was forcibly conscripted to testify for the new one. Her prophecies became a powerful weapon in the theological war for the soul of the empire, a way to say to the pagans, even your own oracles confess the truth of our faith. This was the ultimate malleability of prophecy. The words themselves were secondary. It was their interpretation, and who controlled that interpretation that held the real power. A tradition could be hollowed out and filled with a completely new meaning, its original context stripped away like old paint. The Libyan Sibyl never knew the Messiah she was supposedly predicting. Her lost voice reminds us that the future is not just predicted, it is written and rewritten by those who need it most. While the Pythia breathed the sacred vapor, another oracle unlocked prophecy with a single, potent drink. At the sacred site of Claros, the ritual unfolded not in a sunlit temple, but deep within a dark, subterranean cave. Here, the prophet was always a man who would descend into the earth and drink from a hidden, sacred spring. Though water itself was the key, modern analysis suggests it was likely infused with natural, psychoactive substances, perhaps from algae or mineral deposits, turning it into a potent, hallucinogenic brew. This was not a gentle trance, it was a chemical key turning in the lock of his mind, unlocking a flood of visions and words. Emerging from the cave, his consciousness profoundly altered, the prophet would then deliver his divine messages. But the true miracle, the detail that stunned every witness, was the language. The prophet would speak his prophecies in flawless, poetic verse, often in the native tongue of the person who had come to seek guidance. And this was the ultimate proof of the divine. Historical records insist this man was uneducated, knowing only his own local Greek dialect. Yet here he was, fluently composing complex poetry in Egyptian or Latin or Persian, languages he had never learned. The hidden story of Claros is not just about the water, but about the performance of the impossible. How could this happen? One theory points to the power of the altered state itself. Under the influence of potent hallucinogens, the human brain can sometimes access deep, latent knowledge, perhaps phrases and languages overheard in the bustling port city near Claros and forgotten by the waking mind. A more practical, though no less brilliant, explanation involves the temple priests. Before any seeker could approach the oracle, they were required to submit their name, their homeland, and their question in writing. The priests, therefore, knew exactly who was coming and what language they spoke. It is possible the prophet was subtly prepped, or that the priests themselves, masters of linguistics and poetry, were the true authors, using the prophet's ecstatic ramblings as a foundation for their own sophisticated verses. The man who drank the water became a living instrument, and the priests were the skilled musicians who played him. The miracle of the foreign tongue was the final, masterful touch, a piece of divine theater so convincing it left no room for doubt. The voice of the god was not just powerful, it was personally addressed to you in your own words, a trick of the mind and of man that felt like the ultimate proof of heaven's attention. The most sacred prophecies were sometimes the most expensive to procure. A city like Sparta, famed for its martial discipline, understood that divine favor could be as crucial as a well-drilled phalanx. Before major military campaigns, Spartan kings would send envoys to Delphi not merely as humble petitioners, but as agents of a powerful state, carrying the implicit threat of Spartan displeasure and the explicit promise of lavish gifts. The temple complex itself was filled with magnificent treasuries, small but opulent buildings erected by various city-states, not just as acts of piety, but as permanent, gleaming reminders of their financial influence and political clout. A generous donation could ensure that when a city's question was posed, the priests translating the Pythia's ravings would be inclined to interpret them in a favorable light. This was not a rare occurrence, it was a fundamental part of the political landscape. The hidden story is that this corruption was an open secret, widely known and tacitly accepted by everyone involved. The credibility of an oracle was not based on some naive belief in its perfect objectivity. Instead, it was tied directly to the perceived independence and integrity of its host city and priesthood. When Delphi was strong and relatively neutral, its pronouncements carried immense weight across Greece. But when a single power, like the Thessalian League or later the Macedonians, exerted too much control over the sanctuary, its prophecies were suddenly viewed with suspicion by its rivals. The system had a built-in correction mechanism. If an oracle became too blatantly partisan, its influence would wane among the states it had alienated, damaging its own prestige and the lucrative flow of offerings. This created a delicate balancing act for the priests. They had to appease powerful patrons without making their manipulations so obvious that the entire divine facade crumbled. The voice of the god had to maintain just enough ambiguity, just enough plausible deniability, to serve both the needs of the state and the illusion of divine impartiality. It was a high-stakes game of celestial public relations, where the greatest miracle was keeping the faithful believing even when they knew the game was rigged. Sometimes the price of survival was a stain that lasted for generations. The Oracle of Apollo at Didyma, also known as the Oracle of the Branchidae, was a marvel of the ancient world, a temple complex so vast its ruins still stagger the imagination. Yet its power was broken not by an earthquake or a foreign army's initial assault, but by a choice. When the Persian war machine descended upon the coast of Ionia in the early 5th century before the Common Era, the priests of this great sanctuary faced an impossible decision. The historian Herodotus records that they chose to live. They surrendered the immense treasures of the temple to the Persian king, and in return they were not slaughtered but relocated, reportedly given safe passage and land deep within the Persian Empire. To the Greeks, this was not a pragmatic act of survival. It was the ultimate sacrilege, a betrayal of their god, their people, and their sacred trust. The oracle fell silent, its sacred spring left untended, its colonnades echoing with emptiness. For a century and a half, the memory of this betrayal festered. Then Alexander the Great marched east. As he carved his way through the former Persian heartlands, his army came across a group of townspeople who spoke fluent Greek but lived as Persians. They were the descendants of the very priests who had surrendered Didyma. What happened next is one of the most chilling tales from Alexander's campaigns. According to the sources, Alexander saw their existence not as a community preserving its heritage in exile, but as living proof of their ancestors' treason. In a brutal act of retribution that was part justice, part political theater, he ordered his soldiers to massacre every last one of them. The entire community was wiped out, the bloodline of the Branchidae extinguished as punishment for a crime committed over a century before. This hidden story forces us to confront the darkest aspects of memory and vengeance. Was this divine justice finally served, a cleansing of a sacred stain? Or was it a cynical act by a conquering king, using an old grievance to send a clear message about the consequences of disloyalty? The silence that fell over Didyma was not just the absence of prophecy, but the echo of a choice that doomed a people, proving that some betrayals are a debt that history collects with terrifying compounded interest. The sanctuary at Epidaurus was not a place for prophecies of war or political power, but for a far more personal kind of revelation. Here, in the healing temples known as the Asclepiae, the god Asclepius offered a different kind of truth, one that flowed through the vulnerable landscape of dreams. This was the hidden practice of dream incubation, a systematic ritual to summon a divine cure from the depths of sleep. The process began with a desperate hope. A supplicant suffering from years of blindness, a festering wound, or a mysterious internal illness would first undergo days of purification. They would bathe in sacred springs, offer sacrifices of cakes or roosters, and pray for the god's attention, all designed to cleanse both body and spirit, to make them a receptive vessel for what was to come. Then, as night fell, they were led into the most sacred space, the Abaton, a long, silent hall where no one was permitted to speak. They would lie down on the skin of a sacrificed animal, and in that hushed darkness, surrounded by other ailing hopefuls, they would wait for sleep and for the god. The miracle happened in the dream. Asclepius was said to appear not as a vague symbol, but as a tangible, recognizable figure. He might be accompanied by his sacred serpents, creatures whose shedding skin symbolized renewal and regeneration. To one person, he might simply lay his hands on the afflicted area, and they would awaken cured. For another, the dream was more like a divine consultation. The god could perform a surreal, symbolic surgery right there in the dreamscape, or he might deliver a precise, waking prescription. there are surviving inscriptions that detail these miraculous cures. A man named Ambrosia, blind in one eye, dreamed that the god opened her eyelid and poured a medicine into it. When she awoke, she could see. Another, with a spearhead lodged in his jaw for years, dreamed that the god extracted it, and he woke to find the object lying in his palm. The hidden story here is the profound expansion of what an oracle could be. This was not about foreseeing a distant future, but about intervening in the immediate, painful present. It recognized that the line between the health of the body and the state of the mind was dangerously thin, and that the most powerful healing could come from within, guided by a divine hand in an altered state of consciousness. While kings sought to control empires, ordinary people in the Abaton sought to reclaim the empire of their own bodies, proving that the voice of the gods could be as gentle as a healing touch in a dream. While the Greeks interpreted the rustle of leaves and the Etruscans read divine messages in livers, a world away, kings were listening to the cracks in bone. In the fertile plains of the Yellow River Valley, the Shang dynasty perfected a form of divination that was both brutally physical and astonishingly permanent. The king's diviners would take the shoulder blade of an ox or the flat underside of a turtle shell, the plastron, and carefully polish it smooth. Onto this prepared surface, they would inscribe a direct question to the royal ancestors. Will the harvest be abundant this season? Is it auspicious to launch an attack on the neighboring tribe next week? Will the queen's childbirth be safe? Then, with ritual precision, they would apply intense heat to hollows carved into the back of the bone. The bone, stressed by the fire, would crack with a sharp pop. The pattern of those fractures branching across the inscribed text was the ancestors' reply. A long, straight crack might mean yes, while a fragmented, forked pattern signaled a negative or a warning. The diviner, a master of this cryptic language, would then interpret the message of the cracks, and often the king himself would verify the reading. But the hidden story here is not just the ritual itself. It is what happened to the bones afterward. These were not discarded after a single use. They were filed away in royal archives, a sprawling library of answered prayers and dire warnings etched in bone. For centuries, they lay buried until farmers in the late 19th century began unearthing these strange, inscribed relics, calling them dragon bones and grinding them up for traditional medicine. It was a scholar named Wang Yang who, in 1899, recognized the markings as an ancient form of writing. This accidental discovery unlocked the earliest known corpus of Chinese script, pushing back the recorded history of Chinese civilization by centuries. We now have over 150,000 of these fragments. They are a time capsule, a direct line into the mind of a Bronze Age king. The questions reveal a world where the divine was intimately involved in the affairs of state, where the success of a harvest and the outcome of a skirmish were equally worthy of an audience with the gods. These bones tell us that the hunger to know the future, to seek a sign in the physical world, was a universal human impulse, one that echoed from the temples of Delphi to the royal archives of ancient China. But the voice of the gods could be carried on the shoulders of men. Far to the south of the Mediterranean, on the grand processional avenues of Thebes, the Oracle of Ammon presented a spectacle of divine motion. During great festivals, the statue of the god was not a distant figure in a dark sanctuary. It was a passenger. Priests would carefully place the sacred effigy into a ceremonial boat, a golden bark, and then lift the entire vessel onto their shoulders, becoming the living bearers of a deity's will. The crowd would watch, breathless, as the god began his journey through the city. The hidden ritual was in the walk itself. As the priests moved, the heavy bark would naturally sway and dip with their steps. To the faithful, these were not random movements. A gentle lurch forward was a divine yes. A pronounced tilt backward was a clear no. The priests, feeling the weight shift through the carrying poles, became the interpreters of this physical language. A high official might approach the procession and shout his question over the din of the crowd. Should we begin the harvest early? The priests, their muscles straining under the golden weight, could subtly adjust their gait, collectively leaning into a forward step to make the bark dip in affirmation, or digging in their heels to cause a backward sway of denial. This was divination as a collaborative performance, a fusion of immense physical effort and psychological subtlety. The system was brilliantly resilient. A successful outcome, like a bountiful harvest after a yes, proved the gods' infallible guidance. A failure could always be explained away, the blame placed on the questioner's impurity or a misreading of the gods' complex intentions. The movement of the bark was just ambiguous enough to maintain its sacred mystery. This practice reveals a profound truth that the divine will was often felt as a physical force, a literal weight that guided human action one step at a time. It was a reminder that in the search for answers, sometimes you have to carry your God with you. The God was gone before the emperor even asked his question. In the year 363 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Julian, a man history would call the apostate for his rejection of Christianity, stood at a cultural crossroads. He believed the empire's strength had been sapped by the new faith, and he embarked on a quixotic, desperate campaign to restore the old pagan gods to their former glory. As part of this grand revival, he sent an envoy to Delphi, the heart of the classical world, to seek the blessing of Apollo. But the messenger did not find a bustling sanctuary filled with hopeful seekers. He found a place of eerie silence and decay. The sacred tripod stood empty. The prophetic vapors had long since faded. The voice that had guided kings for a millennium was still. In response to the emperor's plea, the lone remaining priestess, a vestige of a dying world, did not offer a riddle of hope. She offered a eulogy. "Tell the king," she said, "the fair wrought hall has fallen to the ground. Apollo no longer has a roof over his head, the sacred spring is silent, and the talking water has dried up." This was not a prediction of a future that could be changed. It was a stark statement of a present reality. The hidden story here is the profound self-awareness in this final prophecy. The oracle itself was pronouncing its own death sentence. The hall was not going to fall, it had already fallen. Apollo was not losing his roof, he was already exposed to the elements, a god without a home in a world that had moved on. This was the ultimate admission of defeat, not from an enemy, but from within the very institution that had defined divine communication for centuries. For Emperor Julian, the message was a devastating blow to his revivalist dreams, a divine confirmation that his project was doomed. He died in battle later that same year, and his pagan restoration died with him. The final prophecy of Delphi was a poetic epitaph, acknowledging the end of an era with a grace and finality that no conquering army could ever muster. The voice of the gods did not rage against the dying of the light. It simply stated with chilling clarity that the light was gone. The final prophecy from Delphi was a whisper of its own end, but the human hunger it fed never truly vanished. Our modern world, for all its scientific advances, is still filled with the echoes of those ancient oracles. The hidden story is that the psychological machinery of prophecy remains almost entirely unchanged, repurposed for our contemporary anxieties. We still crave certainty in an uncertain world, and a new class of seers has risen to meet that need, using the very same tools as the priests of old. Consider the financial analyst on a news network surrounded by scrolling numbers and complex charts. They offer predictions about the stock market's future, often cloaked in the same strategic ambiguity that defined the riddles of Delphi. A statement like "a period of volatility will precede a potential upswing for the bold investor" is a masterpiece of modern Pythian verse. If the market rises, the prophecy was correct for those who were bold. If it crashes, the warning about volatility was the true message. This is not a new form of magic. It is the ancient principle of confirmation bias, the human tendency to remember the hits and forget the misses perfectly weaponized. We see it again in the daily horoscope, a direct descendant of the oracle's craft. A line like "you are facing a difficult decision, but your innate creativity will guide you" feels deeply personal. It works because of what psychologists call the Barnum effect, our tendency to accept vague, general personality descriptions as uniquely accurate for ourselves. The statement is universal enough to apply to almost anyone, yet we read our own specific struggles into it, just as King Croesus heard only the victory he wanted in the prophecy about a great empire falling. The authority of the source completes the Trinity, just as a message carried more weight coming from the sanctified Pythia at Delphi. A prediction feels more true when it comes from a famous pundit on a major network or a renowned economic forecaster. We transfer our trust to the platform, the title, or the reputation, lending credence to the words spoken. The core mechanisms are identical, only the context has shifted from sacred temples to television studios and smartphone apps. The voice that once spoke through sacred vapor now speaks through data streams and astrological charts, proving that our timeless need to believe in a knowable future is the most powerful prophecy of all. These 25 hidden stories reveal a world where the voice of the gods was never a simple fortune. It was a complex instrument of statecraft, a theater of the mind, and a reflection of our own deepest insecurities. These oracles were not magical crystal balls, but powerful institutions built on a foundation of geology, psychology, and brilliant human manipulation. Every ambiguous riddle, every chemically induced trance, and every politically engineered prophecy served a purpose far greater than predicting tomorrow. They offered a way for kings to legitimize their power, for farmers to endure their uncertainty, and for entire civilizations to navigate a terrifyingly unpredictable world. The true prophecy was not in the words spoken, but in the profound human need that made those words powerful. These ancient figures hold up a mirror to our own timeless fears and ambitions, our endless quest to impose order on chaos and find meaning in the unknown. That hunger to control the future is a thread that connects their world directly to ours. What is the one ancient mystery that still captivates you? Share your favorite theories about the oracles or another historical enigma in the comments below. If you want to keep unraveling history's greatest puzzles with us, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets of the past.